Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on the webinar, which is Beyond Part M, Universal Design and Accessibility Legislation. I'm delighted to welcome you today to our webinar, and my name is TrinityHaus. I'm an architect in private practice, and I also am on the Universal Design Task Force in the RAI. The RAI and its Universal Design Task Force is delighted to partner with the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design to promote today's webinar, which is the second in a series of 4 webinars on different aspects of universal design in the built environment. Before we start, I'd like to highlight some accessibility features of today's webinar to you. Captions are being provided by PCR, and we are also joined by Irish Sign Language interpreters Catherine White and Shelley Gibson. You can turn on and off the captions using the CC button at the bottom of your screen. To control the ISL interpretation, you can use the interpretation icon that looks like a globe, again on the bottom of your screen. On some screens, that might be under the More button. Today's webinar is being recorded. It will be available over the coming weeks on the Centre's website, universaldesign.ie. Today's presentation is by Tom Gray of TrinityHaus. Tom graduated from DIT Bolton Street in 1998 with an honours degree in architecture. He moved to New Zealand in 2003 to complete a 2-year Master's in Architecture, Sustainability of the Built Environment, at the University of Auckland. With over 10 years in architectural practice, working on projects in Ireland, the UK, Croatia, the US and New Zealand, Tom joined TrinityHaus Research Centre in Trinity College Dublin as a research fellow in 2009. Since then, he's undertaken a variety of urban design and building design research projects, exploring the relationship between the built environment and accessibility, inclusion, resilience, and sustainability. All these projects are underpinned by people-centered design, universal design, co-creation, and stakeholder engagement. Tom will speak for about 45 minutes, and we should have 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. Please use the question and answer function on Zoom to send in your questions, and we will get to as many of those as we can. On that note, I will hand over to Tom.
Thank you very much, Katrina. I might look like I graduated in 1988, but it was definitely 1998. So I am going to talk you through some, today's seminar, which is around universal design and accessibility in legislation. And as Katrina said, beyond Part M, I think those in the architectural world work a lot with the building regulations and particularly Part M. But of course, there's a lot of legislation in relation to universal design and accessibility beyond that. And today's seminar is going to be an opportunity to go through that. So I got a very nice introduction there by Katrina, but just to mention again that our research centre is here in Trinity College Dublin. And it's very much around this kind of the role and impact of the built environment in creating inclusive and healthy spaces. So universal design, accessibility and inclusion is really at the heart of so much of our research and what we do. So today's session, and I believe there's 4 sessions in total. The first was presented by Ruth in the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design, who gave a very good overview on universal design itself and the principles and its application and so on. But today we're going to be looking at accessibility in legislation, as I just mentioned there a minute ago. And there's kind of 3 key areas that I want to talk about. One is the kind of overarching conventions and legislation, both internationally and nationally. But then getting into some built environment related codes of practice that are arising from legislation. And again, beyond the building regulations and particularly Part M. And then a quick look at some key European legislation coming into effect and coming down the line. The key learning outcomes from this are awareness of a range of legislation, including the outside the building regulations that relate to universal design and accessibility, knowledge of key sections of the Disability Act 2005 relevant to architectural practice. Really important. And we're going to spend a good bit of time looking at that. And then understanding the difference between minimum requirements of building regulations in universal design. And we'll see in a lot of the legislation and codes of practice and frameworks and so on that we cover, kind of really starts to show the application of universal design beyond and above minimum requirements and so on. So before we get going, because I know as busy practicing architects, you will work a lot around legislation and regulations and so on. But I would like to get your opinion before we get going. Your opinion on how well, or what do you think? The question there is, see some voting going on at the moment, so that's good. And I'll flip back to this. Out of 5, how would you rate current Irish legislation related to universal design and accessibility in the built environment? And if you point your phones and your cameras at that QR code there, that should take you to the question. And I'm just going to pop back to my Vivox. I'm going to stop that for 1 second, and I'm going to reopen it. And I'm going to give you a chance there just to have a quick look and see what we think. Okay. So this changing as we go along. So we're asking you here, how would you rate current Irish regulation related to universal design and accessibility in the built environment? So out of 5 at the moment, and it's fluctuating a little bit, 1 to 2% are only rating it 1. 26, 27% of people are rating it, just giving it a rating of 2. About half, or 44, 45% there, rating it as 3. 24% giving it a rating as 4, and then a very few giving it a rating as 5. But that's interesting, and I think we can explore that now as we go along and looking at that at the various pieces of legislation. So, okay, excellent. I'm going to stop that poll, and we can see there'll be another one in a couple of minutes. So let's go back to the kind of core of what we're doing here. So first of all, let's look at part A. I mentioned that we talk about overarching conventions and legislation. And a really critical one here, of course, is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. So this is about promoting, protecting, and ensuring the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote and respect their inherent dignity. And persons with disabilities, including those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis. And this piece here about in interaction with various barriers is very important. This is a consideration that the environment and services can be disabling for people. So this was signed by the Irish government in 2007 and ratified it in 2018. So if we look at some of the key articles here that really relate and that are relevant to the built environment, we've got Article 4. This is around general obligations to undertake or promote research in the development of universally designed goods, services, equipment, facilities, and so on. So that really relates to the built environment. Article 9, looking at accessibility, to enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life, really critical again for the built environment. Living independently and being included in the community, Article 19, that people have the equal rights of all persons with disabilities to live in the community, and here to have an access to a range of in-home or residential and other community supports. Again, really critical, built environment, and particularly housing. In Article 28, an adequate standard of living and social protection. Persons with disabilities with an adequate standard of living, and then again, housing mentioned here, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. So not just as a kind of a static condition, but how do we continuously improve? Now, there's an optional protocol to the convention, and this is a side agreement that also came into force in 2008. And this creates additional mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation under the convention. And states that who ratify this optional protocol agree to be supervised essentially, or to recognize the competence of a committee on the rights of persons with disabilities, that the committee can request information and make recommendations to a party or a state. Now, interestingly, to date, Ireland has not yet ratified that optional protocol, but there was an announcement just this year that an interdepartmental working group had been formed to work towards its ratification. So that a lot of people would argue that that optional protocol is very important to give teeth, so to speak, to the convention in the country that it's ratified in. So that's the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a really critical international and kind of global framework that impacts greatly on the built environment, designing for persons with disability, but also across the board in terms of inclusion and universal design. So let's come home then to Ireland, where we have the Disability Act passed in 2005. Again, a really critical central plank of legislation in Ireland. And this establishes a statutory basis for a range of issues, including access to mainstream public services and actions to support access to public buildings. And we'll come back to this in a minute. We'll deal with it in a little bit more detail, but also services and information. Obligations on public bodies to be proactive in employing people with disabilities, and the monitoring of compliance with these obligations. And the establishment of a Centre for Excellence in Universal Design, which was done way back then, and who are hosting this seminar today. The Act defines universal design, and Ruth will have talked about this in the first seminar, but it's important maybe to reiterate. It means the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used. Three really important parts of accessibility and universal design there. To the greatest practicable extent, in the most independent and natural manner possible, and in the widest possible range of situations, and without the need for adaptation, modification, assistive devices, or specialized solutions, by persons of any age or size, or having any particular physical, sensory, mental health, or intellectual ability or disability. So a very wide spectrum and scope of people covered. Now, when we look at key aspects of the Act that impact the built environment, there are four that I really want to concentrate on today. Section 25 is around public buildings. Section 26 is around services. Section 29 is around heritage sites. And Section 47 relates to employment. And you'll see as we go through now that all of these are really critical and kind of important, very important, should I say, for the built environment and for designing and the built environment across a number of kind of spatial scales. So we look at Section 25 to start. This is around public buildings, that a public body shall ensure that its public buildings are, as far as practicable, accessible to persons with disabilities. And then they talk about compliance. So at the time of construction, material alterations or extension of the building. And a public building means a building or part of a building to which members of the public generally have access, and which is occupied, managed, or controlled by a public body. So from that we see that this applies to a huge range of public buildings. Anything owned by the state is covered under Section 25. Now, really importantly, of course, it essentially requires the upgrading of older buildings, if required, so that they comply with Part M building regulations. That's at the core of this. And in Section 25.3a, it talks about buildings which are public buildings on the commencement of this section, or which become public buildings after such commencement, shall be brought into compliance with Part M. Okay? Not just new builds or alterations to a building that would typically be covered under the building regulations, but existing buildings, unless the building is already required to be compliant in another way. Now, that at the time was not later than the 31st of December 2015. But moving on then, as Part M has been amended over the years, that each time it's amended, that public buildings have 10 years following the commencement of that amendment to be compliant. So in other words, Part M 2010, which commenced on 1st January 2012, public buildings should comply with that by January 2022. And our most recent amendment to Part M in 2022, which came into effect in January 23, that buildings have until January 2033 to be compliant with the requirements set out in that. So that is a really important piece of legislation here, and huge implications for public buildings owned by the state, public bodies and agencies, and so on. There are exemptions to this. It will not apply to a building if it's being used temporarily, up to or less than 3 years. If the building will not be used as a public building after 3 years, or that making the building accessible would not be justified on the grounds of cost having regard to its use. So obviously, there's a lot of nuances there, but we can see what the exemptions are. However, a ministerial order is required for these exemptions. Now, a very important piece as part of this is a new draft code of practice, which has already gone out for public consultation on accessible public buildings. This has been developed to support public bodies in fulfilling their statutory obligations under Section 25 of the Disability Act. And this will be covered in a little bit more detail in the next section. And that is due to be signed into action, I'm told, early next year. So Section 26 of the Disability Act covers services. And again, this is interesting when you look at what a service is and how this might impact on the built environment. So where a service is provided by a public body, the head of that shall, where practical and appropriate, ensure that the provision of access to the service by a person with and the persons without disabilities are integrated, and that a service means a service or facility of any kind covered by a public body, which is available or accessible to the public generally, or a section of the public. So what's a facility or a service that's open to the public? We could be talking about playgrounds, and we could be talking about lots of spaces like that that are owned by a public body. And that the use of any place or amenity owned, managed, or controlled by a public body is to be covered, or any cultural or heritage services provided by a body. And we'll deal with that in the next section, Section 29, which gets into heritage, accessibility of heritage structures. So again, a lot of implications here. You might be tempted to pass over that thinking, well, the built environment may not be a service, but the way it's described here, service or a facility, very much encompasses the likes of playgrounds and so on, as mentioned, so is appropriate to and relevant to the built environment. Section 29 covers heritage sites, and a lot of you maybe on the webinar now will be used to dealing with heritage sites and will be used to dealing with a code of practice that is out since 2007, dealing with that. But again, similarly, the head of a public body shall, as far as practicable, ensure that the whole or part of a heritage site in its ownership, management, or control to which the public has access is accessible to persons with disabilities and can be visited by them with ease and dignity. That paragraph won't apply, so the exemptions are if it has a significant adverse effect on the conservation status of a species or habitat or the integrity of the heritage site, or compromises the characteristics of the site. So the section, the heritage site, includes a range of buildings and sites and so on, a monument within the meaning of the National Monuments Act, a heritage building or heritage garden or park within the meaning of heritage, a protected structure or a proposed protected structure with any intended grounds, a nature reserve, which is the subject of an establishment order within the meaning of the Wildlife Act 76 and 2000, or a national park, which is owned by the state or under the management and control of the state or the minister. Mentioned already that there is a code of practice available on this. Many of you might be very familiar with it. That that was issued in 2007. And I'm just going to get into some of the details around that just now in a couple of minutes. So the last section just to look at here is section 47, public service employment. And again, this has major implications for designers of the built environment, because a public body shall take all reasonable measures to promote and support the employment by it of persons with disabilities. And that therefore will influence how a place, a facility, a building or space and so on is used and accessed by that person. So four really important elements there, four parts of the Disability Act that are really critical to kind of architectural practice and the design of the built environment. I think particularly section 25, given that it applies to all public buildings and the requirement to bring it into compliance with Part M at those particular stages. So I just want to ask you a question about that. Considering section 25, which we've just gone through, what level of awareness and understanding do you think exists among public bodies about their obligations to bring public buildings into compliance with Part M by certain dates? So I'm just going to go back to our little poll here, and I'm going to open this one. And I'm going to ask you yeah, you're doing it already. So the question here is, what level of awareness? So you're saying that very few of you think it's there's a high level of awareness. A lot of you think, well, certainly 50% of you think that there's a low level of awareness. And then there's a small percentage, 6% say you don't know. So let's just say, recap that again. 11% of you think there's a high level of awareness about obligations under 25. 33% or so think there's a medium, but quite a few, 49%, think there is a low level of awareness about public bodies and their obligations under Section 25 of the Act. So that's quite interesting. And I think it's particularly interesting in the context of Section 25, but the new code of practice around compliance that we'll see signed into action in early next year. So let's watch this space and see, and particularly you will see how maybe your clients or people you are working with in public bodies respond to that to the code of practice and how it affects your daily practice, your daily architectural practice. So let's move on a little bit to other pieces of legislation in Ireland that have major impact really on how people access public spaces and public buildings, but also in many cases how it affects the kind of private sector and employment settings and so on. So the Equal Status Act, so that a number of acts between 2000 and 2018 prohibits the discrimination in the provision of goods and services, accommodation and education under 9 grounds, and they are under gender, under civil status, under family status, under sexual orientation, under religion, age, race, traveller, community, and disability. So they're the 9 grounds for discrimination. And this act states that those selling goods or providing services must provide reasonable accommodation or special treatment or facilities where without these, it would be impossible or unduly difficult for a person with disabilities to avail of the goods and service, unless this would cost more than a normal cost. And of course, what amounts to a normal cost will depend on the circumstances, such as the size and resources of the body involved. But again, the Equal Status Act might not be something that you would consider every day as important in terms of the built environment design but we're seeing implications here around the need to provide reasonable accommodation. Moving on to the Employment Equality Acts. Again, another piece of legislation that may not be in the mind of practicing architects or those involved in the built environment. But again, this is around prohibiting discrimination regarding employment, vocational training, and work experience under 9 grounds, as we talked about earlier on. And the Act obliges employers to make reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities through appropriate measures. And if you look at the Act, that they're kind of expanded on what reasonable accommodation means and what appropriate measures means, but both to meet the needs of disabled people in the workforce. And here, appropriate measures mean effective and practical changes that the employer puts in place to enable employees with a disability to carry out their work. And they can be anything from adapting equipment or facilities to providing training, and so on. Again, an employer might not have to provide these types of measures if they would suffer a disproportionate burden. In other words, if it was beyond the kind of financial capabilities, or it was going to be hugely disruptive to the service. But that has to be demonstrated, that it is a genuine disproportionate burden. So the Employment Equality Act, an important piece of legislation that also has an impact on universal design accessibility in the built environment. I think a lot of you will be aware of the safety, health and welfare at work legislation, because it applies greatly to on-site conditions and so on. But there's a regulation within that that's quite interesting and worth pointing out, that an employer shall ensure that places of work, where necessary, are organised to take account of persons at work with disabilities. In particular, in regards to doors, passageways, staircases, showers, wash basins, lavatories, and workstations used or occupied directly by that person. So again, a lot of you are familiar with this in terms of construction sites and so on. But again, it's a really important, there's an important regulation there that has clear implications for providing accessible work environments for persons with disabilities. Then looking at the public sector equality and human rights duty. Again, a piece of legislation that was passed in 2014. And it arose out of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Act in 2014. This states that all public bodies in Ireland have responsibility to promote equality, prevent discrimination, and protect the human rights of their employees, customers, service users, and everyone affected by their policies and plans. Again, like the previous pieces of legislation, there are major implications here for facilities, for adapting facilities, for ensuring that places and spaces are accessible and universally designed for a wide range of people, including persons with disabilities. Okay, so that was a bit of a rapid run through a whole series of legislation that have a greater or less impact on designing the built environment, accessibility and universal design. But I want to now come to the second part, which is looking at built environment related codes of practice arising from legislation, and we've covered them. Again, and these are beyond regulations and technical guidance documents. So, yep, just to say, we know we have the Building Control Act and associated building regulations and all of the technical guidance documents. That's bread and butter for many of you guys here on the call. But some other, in fact, statutory documents that are already in place or that are coming down the line, and we've mentioned both of them, but I think it's really worthwhile getting into them now in a little bit more detail. And these are the various codes of practice. So first of all, we have, and that's a mistake, it should not be draft, because it's a 2007 Code of Practice on Accessible Heritage Sites. Worth kind of having a quick run through that. And then there's the draft Code of Practice on Accessible Public Buildings arising from Section 25 of the 2005 Disability Act. So we've covered the kind of legislative basis of both of these already in the first section, but now worth getting into them in a little bit of detail just to see how they work. So the Code of Practice on Accessible Heritage Sites, as we know, arises out of Section 29 of the Act. We just mentioned that a couple of moments ago. And that public bodies that comply with this code are considered to be in compliance with the Act. So that's important. This is a statutory code. And if it's complied with, then the public body is in compliance with the Act. The code is supported by an associated complaints process, which applies under various sections in the Act, 38, 39, and 40. But the core of the Act is to ensure that heritage sites are accessible and that it's to be aware of obstacles encountered by persons with physical, sensory, intellectual, or mental health impairments, and understanding that their needs will vary and that this will inform the kind of action that is appropriate and what can be delivered in a heritage site. Fully acknowledging that heritage sites are obviously quite tricky to deal with. The core elements of the code contain these 10 elements. It's the overall planning for accessibility. It's the pre-design or pre-site, pre-visit information. What information do you provide to somebody before they come to the site to prepare them for, for what they're going to experience? Then it gets into approach and entry. It gets into wayfinding. It gets into the external landscape. It gets into the circulation within the buildings on these heritage sites or the heritage buildings themselves. It covers interpretive information available on the site and how that should be accessible to a range of users. It also deals with programs and meetings and events and how they're designed, managed, and handled, and so on to make them as inclusive as possible. It talks about various kinds of facilities within the site, such as toilets and changing facilities and so on. And then, really importantly, it deals with emergency egress. How in the case of fire, for instance, that there's a kind of a fire escape for all approach where persons with disabilities and others can safely leave the site in the case of an emergency or a fire. Moving on to the second code of practice. This is the draft code on accessible public buildings, which I've mentioned has gone out for public consultation, and it is with the minister, and it is due to be signed off early 2025, and providing a document, a statutory code to start it really implementing Section 25 of the Disability Act around public buildings, as mentioned. So it's a source of information for disabled people and their supporters about accessing public buildings and organizations of and for persons with disabilities. It's a statutory instrument. As a statutory instrument, the code should be used and adhered to by those responsible for the management, maintenance, and design of public buildings in conjunction with other legislation, technical documentation, and guidelines concerning accessibility. It also supports the role of the National Disability Authority in monitoring accessibility in public buildings as specified in the National Disability Act. And this is to monitor the implementation of standards and codes of practice and programs provided to persons with disabilities. So fair to say that this is going to be an important code. It's going to apply to a lot of buildings, publicly owned buildings, but a lot of buildings throughout the country, and will have there's going to be lots of implications for public bodies when they have to make sure that the code is complied with. The code has been brought in. It's about raising awareness. It's about addressing needs. It's about identifying obstacles. And a quote there: to ensure buildings are accessible, it is important to be aware of the obstacles encountered by persons with physical, sensory, and intellectual disabilities, mental health difficulties, autism, and other neurodiverse conditions. So again, big range of user and user needs. And the obstacles that people can experience is a few of them listed there. There's lack of awareness of the needs of disabled people that they will have, attributes of the physical environment such as acoustics, design, layout, signage, and so on that can impact people, and information which is often can be presented in inaccessible formats. And then there's the service design piece around the design of systems, procurement, and practices, and so on. So similar to the previous code discussed, there is a number of elements to this which are quite similar, 9 in this case. So there's the planning for the accessibility. Again, there's the pre-visit information. Again, there's the building approach and entry. There's wayfinding. There's circulation within the building. There's the facilities again, as mentioned, toilets and changing facilities and so on. Again, there's the programs, meetings, exhibitions, and events that might take place in a public building. Again, there's the emergency egress, and the 9th is around management and maintenance, which is a really critical part of not just getting it right in the first place, but ensuring that that accessibility and universal design is maintained throughout the life of the building. Really important, and in fact included in Part M. While it doesn't cover management per se, there is information there to make us mindful of issues around management and maintenance to maintain accessibility. As I said, this draft code of practice for accessible buildings will be published in early 2025. So it will be really interesting to see how it impacts in architectural practice and any of you dealing with public bodies around planning, design, adhering to the building regulations and so on. So again, very, very important, and will be published early 2025. Okay, let's go back, because I know when you're looking at kind of legislation around accessibility, universal design, and so on, we do tend to think, those of us working in the built environment tend to really concentrate on the building regulations and the technical guidance documents and so on, and of course codes of practice like the 2 we've just discussed, which kind of inform our opinions around legislation. Just now, having considered the other range of legislation, the various acts, quality acts, equal status, employment, and so on, I'd just like to throw the question maybe back to you now again, in terms of what do you think, having considered all of that, what do you think, has it changed your mind at all? And I think the poll is open there. This could be as much of a reflection on my poor description of the legislation as anything else, but no, certainly I think it's quite clear from that, which was showing a second ago, that in fact they show results. That's why. I think the out of 5 rating has probably increased a little bit there when we take account of the various other legislation accounted for. Okay, great. Thanks for doing that. That's interesting to see. Returning here to our last piece, where we just want to cover key European legislation coming into effect, and really we're going to concentrate here on the European Accessibility Act. So the European Accessibility Act is a directive to improve the functioning of the internal market for accessible products and services by removing barriers created by divergent rules in member states. Now, this was transposed into law in Ireland through the European Accessibility Requirements of Products and Services Regulations 2023, and it comes into effect on the 28th of June 2025 and will introduce accessibility requirements for a range of products and services. Now, a range of products and services. That is the focus on the piece of legislation. However, it does have implications for the built environment because there are many parts where it relates to the built environment that these services and products and services are being supplied. And let us just have a quick look at this. The European Accessibility Act has Annex 3, and while I mentioned earlier on that it does not explicitly or specifically apply to the built environment, there are implications. And mentioned there is an Annex 3 to the Act, which has indicative accessibility requirements for buildings where digital services are provided. So that could be information booths, it could be ticketing machines, and it could be a whole range of other spaces and places where digital services are provided. Annex 3 is not mandatory, and Ireland have not adopted this index. So this annex, and that's important to say. But where it does have direct impact is around a standard called 17210, and we were involved in a seminar around this when it was launched last year. And this is a new European standard. At this point, it's 2 years old or 3 years old around accessibility and usability of the built environment and functional requirements. Now, in line with the Accessibility Act, this standard is being revised and amended to become a harmonized European standard to support the European Accessibility Act. That work is underway, and the revised standard 17210 should be published in the coming year or early 2025. So the European Accessibility Act, very interesting, very important, coming into play in June 2025. At first look, you would think, right, it doesn't really apply to the built environment, but we can see it does when you start talking about where digital services are provided and so on. There's the Annex 3 attached to it, but it's not mandatory, and Ireland have not adopted that. So the Accessibility Act will have an impact, but time will tell to what extent. Okay, fantastic. I am just looking at my time here, and I know we're keen to allow a little bit of Q&A, because I know I've thrown a fair bit of text at you there. There wasn't a whole lot of kind of nice diagrams and images. It was very text heavy, very kind of excerpts from various legislations and acts. But I think it was worthwhile going through that. So at this point, that kind of brings me to the end of the material I want to present, and I'm going to hand back to Katrina. Thank you very much.